There have been many great women who have played a major part in the development of teacher education, and Winifred Mercier was clearly one of them. Wherever she worked, be it the universities of Cambridge or Oxford, or during her time at Leeds Training College, and then at Whitelands College of Education in London, she was an inspirational teacher and leader. Dogged at many points in her life by ill health, but always driven by her deep religious commitment, she had a profound influence not only on numerous individuals who were in the process of becoming teachers, but also, as Laurie mentioned, on the curriculum for initial teacher education. This latter subject, the curriculum of ITE, continues to be debated to this day. Indeed, it's one of several critical issues in teacher education internationally, and here in England we await with interest the outcomes from the current working group on this very topic, established in the wake of the Carter Review of Teacher Education. For the purposes of my talk today, there are two elements in Mercier's approach that I would like to highlight especially. The first is the commitment to what we would now call interdisciplinarity, that is, exploring the boundaries and overlaps between subjects. The second is her profound commitment to the relationship between intellectual development and practical experience in the professional learning of teachers. These are both themes that I'll return to as we explore teacher education in and for the 21st century. Although it's not only women educators and teacher educators that have emphasised these themes, it is certainly the case that a commitment to focusing on the learner has been a common characteristic of many of those great women who have made major contributions. Only 4 months ago, I gave a lecture at the University of Oslo in memory of a great Norwegian educational researcher and teacher educator, Dr. Helga Eng, born very similar year to Winnie, actually, but lived longer. She, Helga Eng, had a profound influence on the development of teacher education in Norway, a country actually which is still leading the way in many respects. But I'm thinking also of people like Maria Montessori in Italy, Susan Isaacs, and both Rachel and Margaret Macmillan in England, or more recently Sylvia Ashton Warner in New Zealand, and Sybil Marshall in England. These were certainly among the people whose work inspired me as I was preparing to be a primary school teacher when undertaking my own B.Ed, Bachelor of Education degree at the College of St Matthias in Bristol in the early 1970s. Also in England, of course, many of the principals of the colleges of education during the 20th century were women, in addition to Mercier herself. And if we look to the USA today, so influential in teacher education research at present, 3 of the most important contributors there are women: Marilyn Cochrane-Smith, Linda Darling-Hammond, and Gloria Ladson-Billings. And on the day after International Women's Day, and in the wake of the recent but long overdue news that a woman has been appointed for the first time as the director of the Institute of Education in London, and the even more overdue appointment of a woman as Vice-Chancellor at my own university, Oxford, it's a great privilege to be offered the opportunity to celebrate the life of Winifred Mercier. My reading of the life of Miss Mercier, as depicted in Greer's biography, with its extremely fascinating introduction by John Dover Wilson, written in a sometimes consciously but sometimes unconsciously male voice, is that it was she who did so much to bring real scholarship into teacher education in England. I would say she was not a great researcher herself, or not primarily, although as a practicing teacher, history teacher, as we just heard, she did undertake practitioner research. But her career was distinguished by scholarship and leadership. She was a great scholar and teacher of the first order who believed that the education of teachers was just as important as the education of the political leaders, lawyers, financiers and others who would hold significant roles in society. The view of teacher education as an integration of intellectual and professional learning that was so much led by people such as Winifred Mercier has recently come under significant threat, especially in England over recent years, as we shall see. In this talk, I want to work through the following 5 themes. Firstly, the politicization of teaching. Secondly, and related to that, the changing nature of teaching and teachers' work. Thirdly, the importance of research in relation to teaching and teacher education, before then saying a few words about underlying values in teacher education, before concluding by suggesting some enduring themes in teacher education that I think will reconnect us with Mercier's work. My conclusion will therefore concern the nature of 21st century teaching and what it is that teachers in this century should know. So firstly, the politicization of teaching. Before we examine the core questions of my talk, let us acknowledge how the wider policy context affecting teachers and their work has changed in the late 20th century and into the 21st, in the years since Winifred Mercier lived and worked. In essence, it's now widely recognised that education has become much more of a political issue than it was formerly, at least in the public domain, that teaching is at the heart of questions of education quality, and therefore the nature of teacher education is very significant. And thirdly, that there are global influences on education and teaching throughout the world, both in what we call the developed world and in the developing world. These universally acknowledged or almost universally acknowledged truths are respectively evidenced by observing any general election where education is always of some significance, by the importance that politicians attach to transnational reports such as those produced by the transnational corporation McKinsey, and thirdly by the overwhelming influence of transnational comparisons such as those provided by the OECD's PISA. As calm and objective analysts of these matters, we may have some deep concerns about the ways in which political ideologies impinge on education, how major corporations may have motives that are not entirely altruistic, and how flawed some of the interpretations of PISA may be. But that is the real educational world we are living in now, and that is the world children are growing up in, and the world in which new teachers are being prepared for their careers. The Finnish educator, Pasi Sahlberg, has of course managed to capture a great deal of this global movement in his term, the germ, the global education reform movement, which in its epidemiological spread around the world has at least the following 5 characteristics, all of which can be detected in some shape or form in most of the education systems around the world. Standardization, judging education against standards. Increased focus on core subjects as prescribed curriculum. The transfer of models from the corporate world into the management, leadership and organisation of schooling. And high stakes accountability policies, nowhere perhaps more so than in the kind of procedures under the Ofsted banner in this country. Sahlberg himself notes that these trends have been far less apparent actually in Finland than in many other countries, even though Finland has perhaps paradoxically been consistently successful in terms of PISA results. The reason that education has become so important in global politics is because of the widely held view that economic progress and development are very dependent on educational progress. In the developing world, this may still be manifest through the prioritization of raising levels of basic literacy and numeracy. In the developed world, however, this focus may be much more on the so-called knowledge economy, where knowledge itself becomes a new form of capital. Education, therefore, is about developing the technical knowledge and intellectual skills that lead to success in economic competitions. That, I'm suggesting, is the dominant way of viewing education today. So, in short, neoliberalism, so that's the best label for these economic, political and social phenomena, has become the dominant ideology across the Western world. Even in the formerly communist countries, we see evidence of marketization becoming increasingly prevalent. Indeed, somewhat against this trend, it's in parts of Europe and Scandinavia where some of the last bastions of social democracy tenaciously linger. As the European historian, the late Tony Judt, put it, as he was contrasting the trust and cooperation which is typical of social democracy with the competition and division typical of more marketized societies, the fact remains that trust and cooperation were crucial building blocks for the modern state, and the more trust there was, the more successful the state. The kind of society where trust is widespread is likely to be fairly compact and homogeneous. The most developed and successful welfare states of Europe, he lists them there. Doesn't include any parts of the United Kingdom, but he might have, I think, perhaps considered Scotland as worthy of inclusion there. But across the world, and especially in England and in the USA, it is that neoliberal polity rather than social democracy that has been underpinning the broadly capitalist economic system, sustaining it, driven by markets and by profit, an essential feature of which is differentiation within the population in terms of ownership and levels of income. Inequality is an inevitable dimension of neoliberalism, and this inequality continues to be both within nation states, although greatly exaggerated in some states more than others, and between nation states, and indeed between economic blocs around the world. My own view, therefore, is that while the visible politics may have changed, and this includes putting education more centrally into the mix, the underlying economic system pertains much as it did throughout the 20th century. Significant social inequalities remain, regional conflicts continue, forced and unforced migrations ensue, poverty persists. And of course, we do also have a new challenge in the form of climate change and the need for environmental sustainability. So, how does all of this relate to teaching and the changing nature of teaching? Against this backdrop of shifting dominant political and educational values, but continuing economic and social challenges, how has the work of teachers changed? Well, as politicians have become increasingly involved in educational policy, we've seen accelerating rates of reform in curriculum, assessment and pedagogy, to invoke Bernstein's 3 educational message systems. These changes have had some major impacts on teachers and their work. And in England, there is currently great concern about recruiting and retaining teachers in the profession. Just last Sunday, some of the headlines in the papers were these. Nikki Morgan, our Education Secretary, says a number of schools are struggling to recruit good teachers, but warned that a talk of a crisis in recruitment may deter people from the sector. In other words, we may have a problem, but please don't talk about it, because we don't want to put people off coming into the profession. And she also acknowledged, I thought this was interesting, the cost of recruiting can be a burden when schools have other better things to be spending money on. adding that £40 billion is to be spent in the next financial year, a figure representing the highest amount this country has ever spent on its schools. Let's focus on commenting to the outside world on what a great profession teaching is, how rewarding it can be, and what good teachers have the power to do. What do we say in the inside world, I wonder, Mrs. Morgan? But she is also worried, and I thought this would be relevant to today's lecture, about some aspects of gender dynamics within teaching. And speaking ahead of International Women's Day, she said the lack of female head teachers is a crippling waste of talent. 3/4 of teachers are women, but only 37% of head teachers are. When asked if teaching is a sexist profession, the Education Secretary said the issue is that until you help women to senior positions to become role models, it's a self-perpetuating cycle. There isn't actually that much research to demonstrate that that is true. There may well be other causes of an imbalance in women in leadership, an underrepresentation of women in leadership. She added there is a danger of groupthink if all the top positions are dominated by men, which is closer to unconscious bias than institutionalized sexism. These are very carefully chosen words. And I'm not sure what language Winifred Mercier would have used, but the Battle of Leeds, described in the biography, was indubitably a struggle against patriarchy in the education system. I say that standing in the James Graham building. These stories from Nikki Morgan emanate from England, and it's becoming increasingly clear that England is something of a special case in these matters, even if workload issues for teachers and gender imbalances are concerns among teachers in many parts of the world. As I have noted before elsewhere, the particular ways in which these political changes have impacted on teaching and teacher education do seem to vary significantly and relate to the relationships that exist within civil society between professionals and politicians, as well as with the wider community and the mass media. My usual exemplar of these differences is the comparison between England and Scotland, two parts of the so-called United Kingdom. Just 5 or 6 years ago, we saw very different approaches to the reform of teaching and teacher education in these two contiguous countries. In England, the then Secretary of State Michael Gove, a politician of course, set out a view of teaching as essentially a craft, to be learned in apprenticeship style, or as he put it, on the job, from existing teachers. In the white paper, The Importance of Teaching, he wrote, "Teaching is a craft best learned as an apprentice. Watching others and being rigorously observed yourself as you develop is the best route to acquiring mastery in the classroom." And I think few of us in this room are going to deny that that is a very important part of becoming a teacher, but to suggest that it is the main or indeed only part of becoming a teacher, I think is suggesting a very narrow view of teaching and teacher education. More or less at the same time, in Scotland, the other side of Hadrian's Wall, the former Chief Inspector of Education there, Graham Donaldson, a professional educationist of course rather than a politician, set out a view of teaching as a complex intellectual activity to be learned through serious study of education and a study of the teaching of the subject as well as through practical experience in school settings. That was in Teaching Scotland's Future, where he says that teachers should be seen as reflective, accomplished and inquiring professionals who have the capacity to engage fully with the complexities of education and to be key actors in shaping and leading educational change. A much more, if I may use the phrase, agentic view of teachers and teaching. He also stressed the important role for universities in teacher education. How can it be that two such different views of teaching and teacher education exist in two advanced nations that are part of the same wider political unit, the UK? Is it simply that one view was expressed by a politician and the other was expressed by a very experienced professional? I would argue that the differences in these publicly stated views of teaching and how they come to be acceptable expressions in each country can only be understood through a wider analysis of the social and cultural positioning of public education and of the occupation of teaching in these two nations. In England, teachers had become increasingly the objects of, to coin Stephen Bull's phrase, a discourse of derision in the mass media and through a relentless series of pamphlets from right-wing think tanks, at least since the 1970s. This had created an extended moral panic within an increasingly competitive world of education where parents are made to feel increasingly anxious about mainstream provision. Indeed, a recent English study suggests that 27% of children aged 10 to 18 have private tutors hired by their families with the aim of enhancing their children's examination results. In Scotland, on the other hand, where public education had long been a significant pillar of Scottish distinctiveness, along with the law and the church, and that had been the case even before devolution at the turn of the last century, education continued to be highly valued by the wider community as a social good, which was offered fairly to all and provided access to opportunity for improvement. Thus, both schools and universities are more highly regarded and indeed continue to be trusted in a way which has been eroded in England during the late 20th century. It's only these kinds of differences, I suggest, that can explain such starkly different public pronouncements on the nature of teaching and therefore such widely different approaches to teacher education that ensue. But if there are stark differences in approach between these two nations, there is one element that they have which is very much in common. That is in the view that a teacher has responsibility for conveying knowledge to children. Whilst many reviews of teacher education, such as the ones I've referred to, do refer to such elements as, quote, technological change, they do not actually challenge the continuing understanding that teachers work in schools where children are brought together in large numbers and that most of the work of teaching is done in classrooms with teachers taking charge of learning for particular periods of time. That is to say, the fundamentals of the organisation of state education are not being challenged, at least in the context of national reports. And these fundamentals have pertained since the late 19th century, since Winifred Mercier's day. Does this mean that current systems are indeed fit for purpose and that this late 19th century invention is indeed the most successful part of what the Anglo-Welsh cultural theorist Raymond Williams described as the long revolution? If we turn to Williams's analysis of the development of state education in Britain, especially England, we can see the continuing influence of the three social forces that he detected in that development. These forces were in constant tension with each other, and the evolving education system was a result of the continuously revised settlements between them. The three influences were, first, the old humanist forces, which emphasised the passing on of a body of knowledge drawn from the culture, usually high culture. Second, the public educators, who emphasised the importance of education for citizenship, having a literate and numerate population so that all could contribute to social development. And third, the industrial trainers, who prioritised the economic importance of education in supplying an appropriately prepared workforce to sustain the economy into the future. So, if these forces continue to operate today, although perhaps it's the industrial trainers who've been in the ascendancy over recent decades, how should we expect the 21st century challenges that I've alluded to be influencing policy and practice? The endurance of the basic organisational units of schooling is really quite extraordinary, given the amount of technological and social change we have seen. So perhaps the question we should ask is, how might we expect the dramatic new challenges of the late 20th and early 21st centuries to impinge on the work of teachers? If globalisation is a wider political and economic process that does more to shape the context for education, it is perhaps within these late 20th, early 21st century themes that we see more direct impact. I'm thinking of such topics as globalisation itself, multiculturalism, migration, technology, including the rapid expansion of social media, the environment, and inequality. How should those themes that are very strong in our current social experience, how should they influence teaching, or indeed the ways in which state education is organised? Well, 5 or 6 years ago, when a team of us at the University of Glasgow undertook a literature review for the Scottish Government as part of Donaldson's wider review of teacher education, we identified different conceptions or paradigms of teaching within the policy and research literature. We had 4. The first we described as the effective teacher, where the emphasis is on the skills in the classroom, the content of the curriculum, and characterised by a sense of performativity, judging teachers' performance in the classroom and children's responses, and looking at things that could be measured. The second paradigm we described as the reflective teacher, which still has an emphasis on skills and content, but with the addition of knowledge about learners and some consideration of the values underlying and the purposes of education. To go a step further, we dubbed the third paradigm the inquiring teacher, which incorporated all of the things above, but added systematic inquiry, the deployment of research and evaluation methods and techniques in the work of the teacher. And the fourth paradigm, and you see how this is becoming a kind of spectrum, a continuum, the transformative teacher who adopts a critical inquiry approach, looking beyond the classroom as well as within the classroom, considering social context, moral and ethical issues, and developing alliances, taking a stance. So the reflective teacher may well recognise the challenges posed by the contemporary issues mentioned above, things like globalisation, multiculturalism, migration. The inquiring teacher may try to see how to improve their teaching in response to those challenges, but it is in the transformative teacher that we may expect to see more active responses. Take an example, the role of teachers ensuring the effective learning of migrant children arriving in their classrooms, to ensure that all children understand the causes of and motivations for migration, although that's clearly a curricular matter as well as a pedagogical one, ensuring that children recognise the way in which environmental matters relate to their own communities as well as to the wider world. And that recent car exhaust emissions debacle with Volkswagen would be one recent example. And making productive use of new technologies whilst developing critical awareness of their deployment at the same time. All those are just 3 examples that would be part of an approach to be taken by a transformative professional working in the 21st century. So I want to turn now, thirdly, to the importance of research in teaching and teacher education. Another major finding of our 2010 literature review was that there are actually some great weaknesses in the field of teacher education research. We've had very few longitudinal or large-scale studies of teacher education in most parts of the world, for what is, as I argued earlier, widely seen as a critical aspect of education systems. Teacher education is under-researched. Elsewhere, I've argued for the importance of research being developed in three relationships with teacher education. There needs to be research in teacher education, on teaching and teacher education, and about teaching and teacher education. And these need to be carried out in every context where teacher education takes place. But we also need to consider the relationship between the work of teachers themselves and research. And so it was in 2012 that BERA, working with the RSA, set up an inquiry into the relationship between research and teacher education. Admittedly, this was in large part established as a response to what was then happening in England, the apparent marginalisation of the university research-led contribution to teacher education. Although BERA, as a UK-wide organisation, considered the situation across all four nations. Having gathered evidence across the UK and having commissioned a number of papers that reviewed evidence from around the world, our core finding was that teaching needs to be imbued with an awareness of research. Indeed, we called for all teachers to be research literate. That does not mean that all teachers should be active researchers all of the time. Rather, it means they should be able to read, evaluate, and use the research findings that are relevant to their work in order to develop their practice. However, we did also go so far as to suggest that teachers should have the capacity and skills to engage in research themselves if the conditions and context are appropriate. As for what teachers should know, and therefore the ideas that should shape the education of teachers in this way of thinking of teachers as research literate, we suggested that there are three overlapping areas as shown in this graphic. So where you might traditionally and historically have found plenty of emphasis on 1 and 2, i.e. subject and pedagogical knowledge and practical experience, the third critical component we suggest is research literacy. And when you put all three together, then that is when you begin to see the genuine teacher as professional emerge from the process of teacher education. It's that understanding that led us to draw attention to the concept of research-informed clinical practice in initial teacher education, which is the topic of one of the papers which the Inquiry commissioned, and actually an approach that can be found in the Oxford University internship scheme, the PGCE scheme that's been running at Oxford since 1980, that I was talking to some of you about earlier today. But also in the west of Scotland, clinical practice model, a range of developments in Norway, Australia, and the USA. So clinical practice, although some people don't like that language, is beginning to influence teacher education practice in many parts of the world. And encouragingly, in England at the moment, there seems to be a groundswell, talking to colleagues earlier who agree with this, there's a movement underway to bring research literacy into play in teaching. Indeed, the kind of work that Laurie's referred to here at Leeds Beckett with several local schools provides one important example, and that's been highlighted at BERA conferences and elsewhere. But we've also seen the emergence of an organisation called Research Ed, teachers themselves taking on research activity. We've seen research and development being established as one of the so-called 6 big ideas for teaching schools. And we've seen the Education Endowment Foundation deploying very significant resources in school-led, school-based research, notably through randomised controlled trials designed to lead to improvements in outcomes for underachieving school students. The plans to establish a college of teaching is also based on a view of teaching as an evidence-based or evidence-informed profession. So there are some very positive signs at present, even while we see some threat to the continuing involvement of universities in initial teacher education. But we do have to be alert to the importance of research being rigorous and systematic, as well as drawing on a full range of methodologies. In some of the initiatives I've just mentioned, this is not always the case. It's not possible, for example, to find all the insights we need, either in schools or across an education system, through the application of randomized controlled trials alone, valuable though those can be. So, to move towards a conclusion, the essence of the argument I've been developing is this. New challenges have been arising over recent decades. These are challenges for governments, for education systems, for schools, and for teachers. The new challenges have not had, and actually seem unlikely to have, a major impact on the organisation of state schooling. Nevertheless, the challenges do bring new responsibilities for teachers, new challenges, and new opportunities. If we continue to see teaching as a profession of moral responsibility that seeks to ensure that every learner is educated in such a way as to make the most of opportunities that suit his or her dispositions, aspiration, and needs, then we do need teachers who are increasingly capable of making difficult judgments in complex situations based on a clear and conscious set of values. Although teachers are working in national systems, this does not necessarily translate into teachers promoting national values, as some English politicians would have it, but rather, as Winifred Mercier might have put it, universal values such as respect, justice, and equity. And in order to inform their judgments, as well as the traditional knowledge of the subject being taught, and of the professional content knowledge and of professional skills, teachers need access to the skills of systematic inquiry, that is, research skills, as well as access to research published by members of the wider academy. So, how does this relate to the enduring themes of teacher education? As we move further into the 21st century, it is crucial that teaching and teacher education continue to be the focus of intensive systematic inquiry, both internally through teacher research and practitioner research, and externally through larger scale research. Large scale projects are extremely important. But thirdly, we also need what might be best called partnership research, that is, inquiry that engages practitioners and academic researchers in collaborative communities of inquiry, very much like the Leeds Beckett model. These three approaches, internal, external, and partnership, can all be brought to bear on what I have suggested are some, or I'm suggesting are some of the enduring themes of teacher education. They should all be brought to bear on the relationship between theory and practice, the nature of professional knowledge, the sites of professional learning, the pedagogical contributions of the school and of the university, curriculum and assessment within teacher education, and the extended continuum of professional learning. These are themes that emerge both historically, for example in Mercier's work, and contemporaneously in any serious consideration of teaching and teacher education. So, inspired by Winifred Mercier and the other great women teacher educators I've mentioned both here in the UK and elsewhere, I wish to reassert first the importance of research. Second, the importance of learners' experience and development. That includes student teachers as learners, of course. The importance of teaching and teachers. The importance of teacher education, and the importance of clear and open communication. To return to my initial questions, in the 21st century, what is a teacher? And what does a 21st century teacher need to know? As I hope I've shown in the discussion above, the answers to these two questions are closely interconnected. And my answer to the combined questions would be something like this. A teacher is a person who has made a decision to help to shape the citizens of the future. This is a decision that has a moral component as well as an occupational component. Teachers therefore need to have a clear understanding, both individually and collectively, of their own values, of the values which will help to sustain a peaceful, fair and just future for their students. They need the skills to assess the learning needs of the students for whom they are responsible in the context of a rapidly changing environment, but also to be continually assessing the impact of policy initiatives on their own practice and on the lives of learners. In order to be in a position to make such judgments, they will need research skills of critical inquiry. If this is a teacher for the 21st century, and if teachers can develop such knowledge as part of their professionalism, then not only will they be making a continuing crucial contribution to the future of society, they are also likely to be increasingly valued, trusted, and respected by the wider community. And I submit, finally, that all of this is entirely consistent with Winifred Mercier's vision of and commitment to teacher education. In a speech given in 1928 to the Training College Association and Association of Directors and Secretaries for Education, she said, "A teacher who cannot or does not wish to go on learning will become a hindrance to the progress of education and a danger to the intellectual development of hundreds of children. There must be time to reflect, to assimilate, to apply, time to read with freedom in a good library, time, in fact, to learn how to learn." Thanks for listening.
Ian, thank you so very much. That was absolutely a wonderful Winifred Mercier public lecture. And on the occasion of the centenary of her resignation, did she stand on principle, Ian? And I think what you have brought to us tonight is a reiteration of those principles for the 21st century. So I am deeply grateful for what you have done, and colleagues, I really hope now that, Ian, if you are able to share the script, the slides, this might become the basis of a professional conversation that will go on from tonight. I sincerely hope that. Ian has agreed to take some questions. We have Millie here with a roving mic. If anybody would like to begin. Here. Would you introduce yourself, please?
Hello, is that, yeah. My name's Jo Bishop. I work at Leeds Beckett. I'm actually working in the youth work team within a different faculty, which is quite strange because we're not in the education faculty, but that's historical and I won't go into that. So my question, first of all, thank you very much. I really took lots and lots from that, and I'm in the final stages of a piece of research which is looking at the learning mentor role in schools, and that's obviously led me to read a lot more about pastoral care in schools, and I was really interested in coming tonight to see if that term pastoral care would have a presence in your lecture in terms of what a 21st century teacher needs to, or looks like, or needs to know. So I kind of wonder what your thoughts were on the change in terms of how many sort of so-called associate professionals are in schools now picking up that kind of work. Also because just on Saturday in my work role I attended a conference in Huddersfield which was looking at the future of youth work as a profession, given that so many of our graduates now end up working in schools in pastoral roles, and I just wondered what your view really was on that mix of professionals in schools. Do you see that as a positive development, that there are people other than teachers thinking about the needs of children and young people?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, very much so, and I'm sure the background to the question is one that would expect a positive answer. I didn't spell out issues around pastoral support for school students, although I do think I drew attention to the need for teachers to be able to assess the needs of pupils, and an important element of assessing those needs in the contemporary school is through discussing children's needs professionally with people with a different skill set to teaching skill set. And so I certainly do think that given the complexity of the experiences of young people in contemporary society, then it's entirely appropriate that interprofessional working is a key part of the development of the teacher profession. And it's a key element, actually it should be a key element in teacher education, and I'm not sure how much it is. I know that within 1 year PGCE courses it's extremely difficult to put more into that curriculum. And at Oxford we do have sessions where our interns, as we call them, meet with people from other related professions, kind of people they'll be working with in school. In some undergraduate programs, certainly in Scotland, there have been serious attempts to integrate some of the study between, for example, social workers and teachers in training. And I can only say that it's an important development in an increasingly complex educational system. So thanks for the question.
Thank you. We've got one up here, I think, and then down here. Just going to take a chair.
Yes. You have that mic as well. Please.
So I'm currently in the middle of writing my dissertation about creativity in schools and the importance of creativity. You spoke a lot about knowledge and skills content and the importance of teachers as providing that for students. But what do you believe would be, or is the value of importance of creative practices and pedagogies within the curriculum alongside the provision of that knowledge and content within the actual school curriculum and classroom settings?
Creativity is an extremely slippery word. I hope your dissertation is starting with a clear definition of what you mean by creativity. And there's been a growing amount of work on creativity in teaching, I think, over recent years. I mean, I would tend to cast the question in terms of teacher agency and teacher decision making. And I think, to me, those are the forms in which an individual teacher's creativity is likely to be communicated, through the kinds of pedagogical and curricular decisions that they're making, either themselves in their own classroom or collectively with other colleagues that they're working with. And if you can accept that, the kind of decision making for teachers as a form of creativity, then I would say it is incredibly important. And in the same moves that we see towards greater use of evidence in teaching, we also see some return of teacher agency, teacher autonomy, teacher decision making. It was very interesting when I was working in Glasgow. One of the projects we did was looking at the implementation of a new curriculum. It's called Curriculum for Excellence, the Scottish national curriculum. They don't use the term national. Curriculum for Excellence. And this was introduced in the early part of the last decade, or midway through. And initially teachers were really quite resistant to take on this new curriculum because they said it didn't tell them enough of what to teach. They'd been so conditioned by the previous curriculum 4 to 18. I'm looking at David, can you remember what it was called? The predecessor of the Curriculum for Excellence was very tightly prescribed, even though officially it was guidance rather than mandatory as it had been in England. Teachers had got so used to not making decisions about curriculum, to not being creative, that they found the challenge when things were less prescribed rather difficult to take on. And I think we may see some of that happening in England as well, if we do get more opportunities to develop the curriculum within schools and within classrooms. So it's a bit of a long way round, and I'm not sure it really directly connects with your question.
Well, with regards to that, the implementation of that new Scottish curriculum, what have been the effects of that? Have they been positive? Obviously, at the start, it was somewhat resisted by the teachers, but did it go on to be a beneficial thing, or is it still being resisted now?
I don't think it's still being resisted. I think they're probably, the jury is out on how successful the changes have been. They have produced a more integrated curriculum than was there before. There are still anxieties in Scotland about low levels of achievement for people from socially disadvantaged backgrounds. That problem hasn't gone away. And now, interestingly, in Wales, we see Graham Donaldson being employed as an advisor in Wales to develop a new curriculum there and to connect it with teacher education reforms, which my colleague John Furlong's been leading in Wales, and some real attempt to bring together, crudely speaking, pedagogy and curriculum. So it's worth looking at what's happening in Wales at the moment. It's a bit behind the Scottish initiative, but it's a lot of change going on there at the moment.
David.
I'm David Halpin. I'm retired and an old mate of Ian's. Ian, you carefully, and I think correctly, didn't distance yourself entirely from Mr. Gove's characterisation of teaching as a craft. Do you have a view about what that craft entails? And relatedly, what kind of research would we look at to bolster a view about what that craft might entail?
It's a very difficult question. In fact, Kerry Philpott's not here, but he's a colleague on the staff here and has written a book in a series that I'm editing where he looks at theories around craft knowledge and other forms of knowledge and conveys them in very clear form. I think he's down south, he said, somewhere. But what do we mean by craft? Of course, it's Richard Sennett wrote a book called The Craftsman, which is a very interesting book to read about how it takes thousands of hours of experience to develop a fully skilled craftspersonship. So it is something to do with the combination of thought and practice, something to do with the combination of intellect and experience. And in teacher education, we typically offer that by putting the learner-teacher into a professional setting where, as Mr. Gove would like, they can observe other teachers teaching and then experience the act of teaching, the acts of teaching themselves. What kind of research does help us understand that? Well, I think it is kind of illuminative, qualitative research that's based on observation and on discourse with teachers, trying to explain what they are doing. And there are some good examples of that kind of research in, for example, Ivor Goodson's work, Pat Sykes' life history work on teachers. Often you find teachers really talking, using very rich language about what they mean by teaching, and they are often talking about craft. They might use words like instinct or intuition, for example, which are not words that would be typically used in a debate around rational cognitive learning. But intuition and instinct are words that teachers themselves will use on the basis of their experience. And I guess that does create a tension for researchers to try and capture that. And because there is no doubt there are some elements of teaching and being a teacher that are extremely difficult to capture in conventional language, which is why Gove can say things
and
like...
they're difficult to sometimes perform as well.
Yeah.
When you and I were colleagues in Bristol, I once supervised a student who had just had a very bad time in school. And I was talking to her about this, and she said to me at one point, "David, will you please stop asking me questions and tell me what to do?" And basically what she was asking me for on that occasion were what we might loosely call some tips for Monday morning. One of the best-selling books when I was a teacher educator was a book called The Craft of the Classroom by the late Michael Marland, which was based entirely on no research whatsoever.
Yeah, and it's probably still used actually around the place. But the book that was dominating our primary courses at what was then Bristol Polytechnic was the book that our colleague Andrew Pollard brought out around that time, called Reflective Teaching in the Primary School. And like you, I remember sitting with a whole group of PGCE primary students talking about reflective teaching, and they said, we don't want to reflect, we want to know what to do. And so there is that tension between actually having the confidence to go and do things that are going to work and understanding the significance of what it is you're doing, both within the classroom but more broadly in a social setting. And that is kind of in essence the dilemma that I think we face in teacher education. And that's why Mr. Gove can get taken seriously, because there are serious elements of truth in what his depiction of teaching and teacher education. But it ain't enough. No. You know, we found in the Bureau report that those systems that actually are achieving most highly, those education systems, are ones where research is taken very seriously, both as a way of informing education, but also as a way of informing the practice of teaching. So, you know, there is evidence now that you cannot sustain a high quality education system through basing your model of teaching simply on a craft model, the effective teaching model, to use that language.
Thanks.
Thanks, Dave.
Any further questions, colleagues? Colleagues, just before... Oh, I beg your pardon.
Oh, it's okay.
No, go on.
If we can, I don't know. If anybody wants to run out, it's fine.
Just please introduce yourself.
I'm Julie Ward. I'm a lecturer at Bradford College in teacher education, parent teacher education and language lecturer. Great. I'm currently undertaking my Masters in Education and looking at motivation and school leaders and how they're supporting their staff and being motivated. And given that you've already identified this evening Nikki Morgan's recruiting crisis that we're not going to mention, and recognition that droves of newly qualified teachers are leaving the profession, sadly, within a couple of years of qualifying, do you think that empowering our teachers to research alone is going to act sufficiently well to motivate teachers to stay?
No, I'm not arguing for research as a key plank in a teacher retention strategy.
Okay.
I'm arguing for it as a key element of teacher learning for high quality education. And what you can reduce, what the kinds of pressures that you could look at reducing on teachers, especially in the early stages of the profession, are some of these performativity measures, the amount of paperwork, bureaucracy. I mean, the unions do talk about that a lot, and there is a lot to be said in terms of reshaping the daily life of a teacher. More informed approaches to assessment that are based on genuine needs, that what teachers need to know about children's learning. That again could bring in research orientation, but it's not about, the main plank of my argument was not actually about retention, although I would hope that if teachers had more self-confidence and gained more respect, which was one of the final things I said, that we would see far fewer of them leaving.
Thank you. You might have just given me a very helpful quote for my next assignment. Thank you.
Any more questions, colleagues? Viv, right in the middle there.
Hi. That's really interesting talk, Ian. And my specialist area is, higher education, and I do every year come along to the Mercier lecture, and I'm always, impressed by the parallels, the similarity of experience across the sectors. I think it's fairly safe to say that, within HE, you know, the whole performativity agenda is writ large. You know, we have some quite radical movements like, you know, student engagement, discourse, etc., which it's almost being hijacked by the performativity agenda, that, you know, student engagement becomes, you know, class attendance, more classroom-based assessment, etc. And kind of while in a way I identify with the kind of practitioner, researcher role and value that, I wonder to what degree, you know, that whole kind of research function, you know, is being, you know, in danger of being hijacked by performativity, being driven by performativity. In other words, I suppose what I'm trying to say is, you know, the criticality, the degree to which teachers and teacher educators can actually be critical about their own practice within that kind of overall framework, which is one where, no, you don't take risks. You are supposed to be seen to be, you know, contributing to the key performance indicators, etc.
No, I mean, you touch on so much in that question. I'm not going to try and answer all elements of it. I would acknowledge that I didn't say anything about teaching in further or higher education, and that is an incredibly important area. There was a really good book a few years ago, edited by Jeff Troman and Bob Jeffrey, called Performativity in Education. It's got chapters in it on higher education as well as on school education, and a chapter by a colleague of me about teacher education. But the bigger questions you raise, I mean, immediately came to mind for me the TEF that's coming in, the Teaching Excellence Framework, to mirror the Research Excellence Framework, going to increase that performative aspect for everybody working in universities in a way that it's not entirely clear it's going to be overall helpful, positive. We will see. And so I do think, yes, managerialism and performativity have transformed the landscape of higher education, occasionally for the better, but too often for the worse, I think, and have kind of commodified a lot of what is going on. So it's a very challenging landscape in which to operate as a genuine academic, you know, in a traditional sense of an academic being somebody who can offer new insights, critical insights into their, in the case of professional work, into practice, but more generally into understanding the world around us. So I can't answer the whole of your question other than to say I agree. It's really important that we consider the higher education context as well.
Colleagues, Ian is going to join us in what we traditionally call a reception. So for those of you who can stay, we will be in the Jubilee room, and Ian's agreed to continue these very rich conversations. So I would like to extend that invitation to you and hope that we might see quite a few of you. They've got lovely lounge chairs set up in the Jubilee room. But I would say thank you once again, Ian, as I now pass over to our new head of school, Dr. Damien Page, to come and do the formal vote of thanks. So thank you very much.
Thanks. Well, thank you very much, colleagues. It's nice to see so many people from further education, from schools, our partners, and also the academics working in. So I was listening to Ian talk. I wondered what Winifred Mercier's day would look like if she was working here now. In the morning, she might have been preparing for Ofsted, which we currently are. She might have been thinking about, we round up that 92.8% to 93% in terms of our outcomes, because it looks better for Ofsted. In the afternoon, she might have gone back and had a discussion with some of her colleagues about whether online submission will increase our NSS rating, especially around feedback. And then after that, she might have gone back to her office, looked at the publication that Laurie held up and thought, will this make it into the ref? That would have been a typical day for Winifred now. So it's nice to finish a day in higher education, in schools, in further education, wherever you happen to be, where we can think about the principles of what we do. And Ian's you know, expertly remind us about what it is we try to do despite the REF, despite the NSS, despite Ofsted, and all the other restrictions and the performativities that we have to deal with on a daily basis. And we have to work around, and that's where we have to become experts on. We have to play the game, but we have to do it for the right reasons. And that's our kind of resistance as educators. So I thank Ian for, you're very welcome for coming along, and thank you all for attending.